You know what separates a good commander from a legendary one? It's not courage. It's not even brilliance. It's the ability to see, truly see, when your enemy makes that one fatal mistake, and then strike before they even realize what they've done. July 22nd, 1812. Salamanca, Spain. The dust hangs thick in the afternoon air, coating thousands of men in rust-colored powder that makes them look like ghosts already. And standing on a ridge overlooking a sprawling valley, there's a man watching. Just watching. His name is Arthur Wellington, Duke of Wellington. But right now, in this moment, with the sun beating down mercilessly and 40,000 men waiting for his orders, he's just a man with a telescope pressed to his eye, scanning the horizon for something most people would never notice. Behind him, his officers shuffle nervously. They'd been marching and counter-marching for weeks, playing this deadly dance with Marshal Marmont's French army. Both sides circling, probing, neither willing to commit. It's exhausting, maddening, and every single person on this ridge wants to know, when will Wellington give the order? But Wellington doesn't speak, he just watches. And somewhere out there, across the golden wheat fields and dusty hills of Spain, Marshal Marmont is about to make a choice that will echo through history. Let me tell you how one moment, one single decision made in the heat and confusion of war can destroy an army. 3 weeks earlier, Wellington wasn't thinking about grand victories. He was thinking about survival. The Peninsular War had been grinding on for 4 brutal years. Napoleon's forces occupied most of Spain, and Wellington's British and Portuguese army was just one thorn in the French emperor's side, a persistent, annoying thorn, but nothing that couldn't be dealt with, eventually. Wellington sat in his command tent outside Ciudad Rodrigo, maps spread before him like entrails he was trying to read for omens. His fingers traced the roads leading south, calculating distances, supply lines, enemy positions, always calculating. The tent itself was sparse. Wellington had no patience for luxury in the field. A folding table, a camp bed, a trunk containing his personal effects. That was it. Some generals traveled with wine cellars and personal chefs. Wellington traveled with maps and a sharp mind, and he believed the latter were far more valuable than the former. "Sir." The voice belonged to Major General Edward Pakenham, Wellington's brother-in-law and one of his most trusted commanders. Pakenham ducked into the tent, his uniform dusty from riding. He was 34 years old, with the kind of eager energy that made older officers either admire him or distrust him. Wellington did both. "How many?" Wellington asked, not looking up from his maps. Pakenham knew better than to ask, "How many what?" Wellington always knew what he was asking about. 42,000, maybe more. Marmont's consolidated his forces and he's heading southeast towards Salamanca. Now Wellington's eyes lifted. They were cold eyes, analytical, the kind that could dissect a problem like a surgeon with a scalpel. People who met Wellington for the first time often found those eyes unsettling. They saw too much, judged too quickly, forgave too rarely. "He's trying to draw us out," Wellington said. "Or he's trying to get between us and Portugal," suggested Pakenham, moving to the map and pointing at the road networks. "If he takes Salamanca and holds it, he cuts our supply lines. We'd be forced to either fight him on his terms or retreat back to Portugal with our tails between our legs." It was a fair point, and it illustrated exactly why Wellington valued Pakenham despite his youth. The man could think strategically, see beyond the immediate tactical situation to the broader implications of enemy movements. Marmont, the Duke of Ragusa, was one of Napoleon's better marshals, young, energetic, aggressive. At 37, he was actually older than Pakenham, but younger than Wellington, who was 43. He'd been appointed to command French forces in Spain specifically to deal with Wellington, replacing the previous commander who'd proven too cautious, too easily outmaneuvered. Napoleon's instructions to Marmont were clear. Destroy Wellington's army or drive him back to Portugal. The Spanish situation is becoming untenable and we need the British out of the equation. For weeks now, the two armies had been shadowboxing, each trying to outmaneuver the other without committing to a decisive battle. It was like watching two prize-fighters circling the ring, jabbing, feinting, neither willing to throw the knockout punch because they knew one mistake could end the fight. Because battles were risks. Massive, terrifying risks. You could lose thousands of men in a few hours. You could lose your entire army if things went badly enough. And both Wellington and Marmont knew that one major defeat could mean the end of everything they'd fought for. Wellington stood, rolling up his maps with methodical precision. Every movement he made was economical, efficient. He wasted nothing, not time, not energy, not words. We follow, but we keep our distance. I want to see what he's planning before we commit to anything. The men are getting restless, Pakenham said carefully. They want to fight. They're tired of marching. Wellington's expression didn't change. The men want a lot of things. They want their pay on time, they want better rations, they want pretty Spanish girls and unlimited wine. What the men want and what's actually good for them are rarely the same thing. It was a harsh assessment, but not entirely unfair. Wellington had a complicated relationship with the soldiers under his command. He called them the scum of the earth in private letters, referring to the fact that many had enlisted to escape poverty or criminal prosecution. But he also trained them relentlessly, fed them as well as logistics allowed, and won battles that kept them alive. They might not love him the way French soldiers loved Napoleon, but they trusted him. And in war, trust was worth more than love. And so began 3 weeks of the most intricate military dance you can imagine. 2 armies totaling nearly 80,000 men marching parallel to each other across the Spanish countryside, sometimes so close the soldiers could shout insults across the gaps, sometimes separated by miles of rolling hills. Private Thomas Browning of the 45th Regiment of Foot didn't understand strategy. He didn't understand Wellington's careful calculations or Marmont's aggressive maneuvering. What he understood was that his feet hurt, his uniform was soaked with sweat, and he'd been marching in this godforsaken Spanish heat for 3 weeks with nothing to show for it but blisters and exhaustion. "When are we gonna fight these French bastards?" he muttered to his mate, Private William Cooper, as they trudged along yet another dusty road. Cooper, who was slightly older and slightly wiser, shrugged. "When the Duke says so, I reckon. He's got his reasons." "His reasons can kiss my arse. My feet are bleeding, we're nearly out of water, and I can see the bloody Frenchies right over there." He gestured toward the parallel ridge where French soldiers were marching in the same direction, close enough that you could make out individual figures. "You want to fight them? Really?" Cooper asked. Browning was quiet for a moment. The truth was, he didn't. He'd been in enough skirmishes to know that fighting meant watching friends die, meant the screaming chaos of musket fire and cannon blasts, meant the very real possibility that you'd end the day with a French bayonet in your guts. But marching endlessly with no resolution was its own kind of torture. At least a battle gave you a sense of purpose, of progress. This just felt like slowly walking to nothing. The soldiers weren't the only ones frustrated. In the French camp, the mood was similar. Lieutenant Jean-Baptiste Mercier of the 22nd Line Infantry had joined Napoleon's army 7 years ago, full of revolutionary zeal and dreams of glory. He'd marched across Europe, fought at Austerlitz and Jena, seen Napoleon crowned as emperor, and watched the Grande Armée conquer half the continent. Spain was supposed to be easy. A quick campaign to install Napoleon's brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, pacify the locals, and move on to the next conquest. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare. Spanish guerrillas attacked French supply columns, assassinated French officials, and disappeared into the mountains before they could be caught. The British had landed an army that refused to be defeated. And now, here they were, marching back and forth across the same stretch of Spanish countryside like dancers in some absurd ballet. "Marmont should just attack," Mercier said to his sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Dufour who'd been with the army since the Revolution. Dufour spat tobacco juice and squinted at the distant British forces. "Marmont's smart enough to know that Wellington's not an easy target. You don't just attack the English in Spain. You need the right position, the right timing. We've been waiting for the right timing for 3 weeks. Better 3 weeks of waiting than 3 hours of dying," Dufour said philosophically. "I've seen enough battles to know that patience saves lives." But even Dufour was getting impatient, and if the soldiers were impatient, their commanders were even more so. Wellington's army moved like a coiled spring, ready to strike but never quite committing. His divisions were kept close together, able to concentrate quickly if needed. It was defensive but also flexible, allowing him to respond rapidly to whatever Marmont attempted. Marmont's forces did the same initially, but as the days wore on and Wellington showed no inclination to fight, Marmont began to change his approach. On the evening of July 20th, Marmont called his senior commanders together for a council of war. They met in a farmhouse that had been commandeered for use as his headquarters, the officers crowding into what had once been someone's kitchen, now filled with maps and military equipment. "Gentlemen," Marmont began, his voice tight with frustration, "we cannot continue like this indefinitely. Our supplies are running low, the men are exhausted, and every day we spend marching back and forth is a day Wellington uses to strengthen his position." General Bonnet, his chief of staff, nodded agreement. "What do you propose?" Marmont studied the map spread across the rough wooden table. "We need to force Wellington's hand. If we can get around his right flank, cut the road to Ciudad Rodrigo, we can force him to either retreat into Portugal or fight us on ground of our choosing." "And if he chooses to fight?" asked General Thomiers, commander of one of Marmont's divisions. "Then we fight, and we win. Our army is as large as his, our soldiers are veterans of a dozen campaigns, and Napoleon himself has faith in our ability to defeat the British." It sounded confident, but there was something in Marmont's voice, a slight edge of desperation that suggested he wasn't quite as certain as he wanted to appear. The problem was that Marmont was feeling pressure from multiple directions. Napoleon expected results, the Spanish guerrillas were making it increasingly difficult to maintain supply lines, and Wellington's refusal to commit to battle was making Marmont look indecisive, possibly even cowardly. So Marmont made a decision. Tomorrow, they would begin aggressive flanking movement. They would stretch their line westward, trying to get past Wellington's right flank and cut his communications with Portugal. It was a sound strategy in theory, but it required precise coordination and discipline to execute without creating dangerous gaps in the French line. The next morning, July 21st, both armies were on the move early. The sun rose blood red over the Spanish plains, and soldiers on both sides took it as an omen, though they disagreed on whether it was a good one or bad one. Wellington watched the French movements carefully from his observation post. He'd chosen a hill with excellent visibility, and he stood there with his telescope, methodically scanning the French positions as they began their march westward. "They're extending," observed Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Gordon, Wellington's aide-de-camp. He was young, intelligent, and devoted to Wellington with the kind of loyalty that came from genuine respect rather than mere duty. "Yes," Wellington said quietly. "The question is how far they'll extend before they realize what they're doing." Gordon looked puzzled. "What are they doing, sir?" Wellington lowered his telescope and looked at his aide. "They're making a mistake. Slowly, incrementally, but definitely. Marmont is so focused on getting around our flank that he's forgetting the first principle of warfare. Maintain your cohesion. Should we attack? Not yet. Let them commit to the movement. Let them stretch a little more. If we attack too early, they'll simply contract back into a tight formation, and we'll have accomplished nothing except losing men in a frontal assault." It was this kind of patience that frustrated Wellington's officers, but also made him so effective. He could see the battle unfolding hours before it actually happened, could predict enemy movements and prepare responses, all while maintaining an exterior of absolute calm. But inside, Wellington's mind was racing. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. If Marmont continued this flanking movement, if he stretched his line far enough, there would be a moment, brief but definite, when the French army would be vulnerable, extended, separated, unable to support itself. The question was whether Marmont would realize his mistake before Wellington could exploit it. By noon on July 22nd, the temperature had climbed into the 90s Fahrenheit. It was the kind of heat that made men dizzy, that turned metal equipment too hot to touch, that sucked the moisture out of your body faster than you could replace it. Both armies were suffering. Men collapsed from heat stroke, their faces flushed and their breathing shallow. Officers rode up and down the columns, shouting encouragement, distributing what little water remained, trying to keep formations intact even as individual soldiers stumbled and fell.
Private Browning was beyond complaining. He was beyond thinking. He just put one foot in front of the other, following the man ahead of him, his entire world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next moment of not collapsing. Beside him, Cooper had gone quiet too. Neither had the energy for conversation anymore. In the French army, Lieutenant Mercier was having similar thoughts. The revolutionary zeal that had sustained him through years of campaigning was wearing thin in the Spanish heat. He was starting to understand why veterans like Sergeant Dufour approached war with grim resignation rather than enthusiasm. Glory, he was learning, usually involved a lot more suffering than the recruitment posters suggested. And still, the armies marched. Marmont stood on the Arapil Grande, a prominent hill that gave him excellent visibility of the battlefield, wiping sweat from his face with a handkerchief that was already soaked through. He was 37 years old, barrel-chested and energetic with the kind of confidence that came from years of victories under Napoleon's command.
But right now, watching his army stretch westward in pursuit of Wellington's flank, he felt the first whisper of doubt. "Where is he going?" Marmont demanded, staring across the valley at Wellington's forces. General Bonnet, standing beside him, shook his head. "Still matching our movements, but he's staying concentrated. We're getting strung out." Marmont could see it. His army had started the day in tight formation, but as they'd marched westward trying to outflank Wellington, the divisions had begun to separate. First hundreds of yards, then half a mile. Now, in some places, more than a mile between units. It was necessary, he told himself, to overlap Wellington's position. To get around his flank, you had to spread out. It was basic tactics, the kind of maneuver Napoleon himself had used dozens of times. But something nagged at him, some instinct born from years of combat experience that said this wasn't right, that he was missing something important. "Should we halt and consolidate?" Bonnet suggested carefully. He was older than Marmont, more cautious by nature, and he could see the danger in their current formation. Marmont glanced at the sun. It was past noon now, past 1 o'clock. If they were going to force a decision today, it had to be soon. Otherwise, they'd be stuck in this dance for another day, another week, another month. And Marmont was tired of dancing, tired of being cautious, tired of being the marshal who couldn't defeat Wellington when Napoleon had sent him specifically for that purpose. "No," he said firmly, "keep pushing forward. General Thomières, take your division further west. I want you past Wellington's right flank by mid-afternoon. Once you're in position, the rest of the army will advance, and we'll force Wellington to either retreat or fight at a disadvantage." Bonnet hesitated. "That will put Thomières nearly 2 miles ahead of our main body. If Wellington attacks—" "Wellington won't attack," Marmont interrupted. "He's been retreating and avoiding battle for 3 weeks. He's cautious to the point of timidity. By the time he decides to do anything, we'll have consolidated our position." It was a decision made from frustration more than strategy, from the desire to end this stalemate, to prove himself, to win the kind of decisive victory that would make Napoleon notice, and perhaps even earn him command of the prestigious Imperial Guard. It was also a mistake, and Wellington was watching. Wellington saw it immediately. He was eating lunch, cold meat again. He barely noticed what he ate during campaigns. When one of his scouts came galloping up, the horse's flanks heaving, foam at its mouth from being ridden hard. "Sir, the French division on their left, Thomières' division, they're pulling ahead of the rest of their line, significantly ahead, maybe 2 miles. Wellington dropped his food without a second thought and grabbed his telescope. He scanned the French positions with intense focus, and there it was, clear as day, unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Thomières' division, maybe 8,000 men, strung out in a long column, separated from the next French division by a gap of at least 1.5 miles, possibly more. They were marching confidently, apparently unaware that they'd become isolated from the support of the main French army. It was the mistake Wellington had been waiting for. "Dear God," Wellington whispered. Then, louder, his voice suddenly urgent, "Pakenham, Gordon, to me, now." His officers came running from various parts of the camp. Wellington didn't wait for them to catch their breath. He pointed across the valley with barely controlled excitement. "Look there, carefully. What do you see?" Pakenham studied the French line for a long moment, his experienced eye taking in the positions, the distances, the implications. Then his eyes widened in understanding. They're divided. Tonnerre's is isolated from the rest of Marmont's army. More than isolated, Wellington said, his voice tight with controlled excitement that his officers had rarely heard from their usually impassive commander. More than isolated. He's exposed, completely exposed, and if we move quickly, right now, this instant, we can hit him with overwhelming force before the rest of Marmont's army can react or provide support. It was the moment he'd been waiting for, training for his entire military career. The mistake, the fatal miscalculation born from an enemy's impatience and frustration. But to exploit it meant acting immediately. No time for elaborate planning or careful positioning. No time to write detailed orders or hold councils of war. Just raw speed, decisive action, and absolute trust that his commanders would execute without hesitation. Wellington stood up so fast his chair fell over backward. He didn't notice or care. "Pakenham, take your 3rd Division and move now, I mean right now, immediately, to hit Tonnerre's left flank. Gordon, bring up Pack's Portuguese brigade to support. I want Bradford's Portuguese on their right. We're going to envelop them completely." Around him, his staff erupted into controlled chaos, officers mounting horses, messengers galloping in every direction, orders being shouted down the line, drums beginning to beat the rapid tattoo that signaled movement to battle stations. This was what separated Wellington from other commanders, from the cautious generals who studied warfare from books and the aggressive generals who attacked without thinking. Not just the ability to see the opportunity, but the willingness to seize it instantly, without hesitation, without second-guessing. Because in war, opportunities don't wait politely for you to make up your mind. They appear for a heartbeat, sometimes literally just minutes, and then vanish. And commanders who hesitate are commanders who lose. Pakenham mounted his horse, his face showing equal measures of excitement and fear. He was about to lead thousands of men into battle, and the outcome would rest significantly on his shoulders. "Any specific instructions, sir?" Wellington's expression was pure steel, the kind of look that made men willing to follow him into hell itself. "Hit them hard and hit them fast. Don't let them form proper defensive squares. Don't give them time to organize. We need to destroy that division before Marmont realizes what's happening and sends reinforcements. Speed and violence, Pakenham. Speed and violence." And if the rest of their army comes to support Tonnerre's, Wellington will deal with that when it happens. But right now, in this moment, we have 8,000 Frenchmen isolated and vulnerable and completely unprepared for what's about to hit them. Don't waste it. Don't hesitate. Just attack. Pakenham saluted and wheeled his horse, galloping towards his division. Within minutes, literally minutes, thousands of British and Portuguese soldiers were moving, not marching in the usual disciplined columns, but running, double-timing towards positions where they could assault the exposed French flank. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, getting their men into position. Sergeants physically grabbed soldiers and pushed them into formation. Artillery crews manhandled their guns forward, the wheels bouncing over rough terrain, the gunners knowing they'd have only minutes to set up before the infantry assault began. It was organized chaos, but it was organized by men who'd been training for exactly this kind of rapid deployment. Private Browning, who'd been half asleep on his feet from exhaustion and heat, suddenly found himself running towards an enemy he couldn't even see yet. "What's happening?" he shouted to Cooper.
"We're attacking!" Cooper yelled back, his earlier philosophical calm replaced by the urgent energy that came from knowing battle was imminent. "Attacking what? Does it bloody matter? Just run!" They ran. Thousands of them, their exhaustion forgotten in the rush of adrenaline that came from knowing you were about to fight for your life. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. In exactly 45 minutes, the entire battle would be decided, though none of the men running toward their positions knew that yet. They just knew they were finally going to fight. And in the French army, General Thomier still had no idea what was about to hit him. Thomier was confident as his division marched westward. He was 47 years old, a veteran of 2 decades of revolutionary and Napoleonic warfare. He'd fought at Rivoli, at Marengo, had been wounded twice and decorated 3 times. He knew his business. His orders were clear: extend past Wellington's right flank, establish a strong position, and wait for the rest of the French army to come up in support. It was a standard flanking maneuver, the kind he'd executed dozens of times before. His division was in march column formation, the fastest way to move large numbers of men over distance, but also the most vulnerable if attacked. You couldn't fight effectively from column. You needed to deploy into line, where all your muskets could bear on the enemy. But Thomier wasn't worried about being attacked. Wellington had been avoiding battle for weeks. There was no reason to think he'd suddenly become aggressive now. The first indication something was wrong came from Captain Dubois, commanding the scouts at the rear of Thomier's column. Dubois was riding back along his division's line of march when he saw something that made his stomach drop. Movement on the ridge to their right. Lots of movement. Thousands of soldiers appearing as if from nowhere. Formations spreading out. Flags being raised. Artillery being positioned. British soldiers. Portuguese troops. Coming fast. Coming right at them. Dubois spurred his horse forward, galloping toward where Thomier rode at the head of the column. "General! General, we're being attacked! British forces coming from the ridge to our right!" Thomier turned, his face showing confusion more than alarm. "Attacked? How many?" "Thousands! Maybe an entire division! They're deploying for assault!" Now Thomier understood the danger. His division was strung out in march column, extended over nearly 2 miles of road, completely unprepared for combat. And somewhere up on that ridge, he could see them now, British redcoats and Portuguese infantry in their distinctive uniforms. An entire enemy force was about to crash into his exposed flank. "Form line!" Thomier roared. "All battalions, form line! Artillery, get into action! We need defensive positions now!" His officers took up the cry, galloping up and down the column, shouting orders. Drummers beat the complex rhythms that signaled deployment from column to line. Sergeants physically grabbed men and pulled them into position. But it takes time to deploy from column to line. You need space to maneuver. You need clear ground. You need soldiers who aren't exhausted from marching in brutal heat. Most importantly, you need time. At least 15 or 20 minutes for a well-trained division to make the transition smoothly. Thomier had maybe 5 minutes before the British struck. His men tried. God knows they tried. They were Napoleon soldiers, veterans of campaigns across Europe. They knew their drill, knew their business. Officers shouted commands, corporals pushed men into formation. The division began the complex dance of transforming from a long snake of marching men into a proper battle line. But they were too slow. The British were too fast, and the ground was too broken, the formation too extended, the situation too chaotic. Pakenham's division hit them like a hammer hitting glass. 3,000 British infantry, supported by 2,000 Portuguese troops and 6 artillery pieces, crashed into the unprepared French column. The sound was indescribable. Hundreds of muskets firing in coordinated volleys that sounded like massive sheets of canvas being torn apart. Men screaming, officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the chaos, horses shrieking in panic, drums beating frantically. The British had learned hard lessons over years of fighting Napoleon's armies. They knew how to deliver volley fire with devastating efficiency. They formed 2 ranks, the front rank kneeling, the rear rank standing. On command, both ranks would fire simultaneously, sending a wall of lead musket balls at the enemy at close range, then immediately begin reloading, while their sergeants kept them dressed in tight formation. French soldiers fell in heaps.
Not because they were cowards or because they weren't trying to fight back, but because they were caught in the worst possible situation, trying to deploy into fighting formation while under fire, packed together in column where every musket ball that struck one man often went through to hit the man behind him. Tommier himself was everywhere, trying desperately to organize a defense. His horse had been shot from under him within the first 2 minutes. He was fighting on foot now, his uniform torn, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead where a musket ball had grazed his skull. 22nd line, form square on me, he shouted, trying to create a defensive position that could hold against the British assault. A square formation, with men facing outward on all sides, was the best defense against infantry attack. Some men heard him. Maybe 200 formed up around their general, creating a rough square that immediately began firing outward at the British troops surrounding them. For a few minutes, it looked like they might hold. The square fired disciplined volleys, keeping the British at bay. Tommier, blood-soaked but defiant, stood in the center, directing fire, encouraging his men. Then, the Portuguese artillery unlimbered and fired canister shot directly into the square at close range. Canister shot was essentially a giant shotgun shell, a metal canister filled with dozens of musket balls that spread out when fired, creating a devastating blast at short range. 3 guns fired simultaneously into the French square. The square disintegrated. Men were literally torn apart by the blast. The survivors broke and ran, all cohesion lost, all discipline forgotten, just pure survival instinct taking over. Tommier tried to rally them. He stood his ground, waving his sword, shouting for his men to stand and fight. A British sergeant, seeing the French general, raised his musket and fired from about 30 yards away. The ball struck Tommier in the chest. He staggered, dropped to one knee, tried to stand again. A second shot hit him, then a third. The general fell and didn't get up again. Without their commander, without any organized leadership, the French division collapsed completely. Officers tried to organize rearguard actions, to form defensive positions, but it was useless. The division had been shattered, and now it was every man for himself. Soldiers threw away their muskets to run faster. Equipment was abandoned, packs, spare ammunition, even regimental flags. Wounded men were left behind, crying out for help that wasn't coming. The division that had marched confidently westward just an hour ago was now a mob of terrified men, streaming back toward the main French army in complete disorder.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Private Browning found himself in the middle of the assault, loading and firing his musket with mechanical efficiency, barely seeing what he was shooting at through the thick smoke. Next to him, Cooper was doing the same. All around them, men were firing, reloading, firing again, the British sergeants keeping them in line, keeping them shooting. "Forward! Forward!" an officer shouted. Browning didn't even know which officer, couldn't see through the smoke, just heard the voice and obeyed. The British line advanced, stepping over French wounded, pushing through the chaos, maintaining their formation even as they moved forward. This was what years of drill accomplished, the ability to maintain discipline even in the chaos of battle. Within 20 minutes of the first shot being fired, Tommier's division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The survivors were running, the wounded were scattered across half a mile of battlefield, and the British were in control of the ground. Pakenham, his uniform torn and bloodied, but himself miraculously unwounded, rode back toward where Wellington was observing the battle. His face showed the strain of what he'd just experienced, the terror and exhilaration of leading men in combat, the guilt of seeing men die under his command, the pride of having executed his orders successfully. "It's done, sir," he reported. "Tommier's division is destroyed. They're running back toward their main army in complete disorder." Wellington nodded, his face showing satisfaction but not surprise. This was exactly what he'd expected to happen. "Casualties?" "Light, relatively speaking,"
maybe 400 killed and wounded. The French lost thousands. Good. Now consolidate your position and prepare for the French counterattack, because Marmont isn't going to let this stand. Wellington was right. The French marshal had seen his left flank collapse and immediately grasped what had happened. Wellington had baited him, let him overextend, and then struck with surgical precision at his weakest point. It was brilliant, it was infuriating, and it was potentially catastrophic for the French army. Marmont immediately began issuing orders to counterattack, to support what remained of Thomier's division, to prevent Wellington from exploiting the breakthrough. French divisions began moving, trying to close the gap, trying to restore the integrity of their line. But Wellington wasn't done. General Leith, Wellington called to another of his division commanders, take the 5th Division forward. I want you to hit the next French division in line before they can properly deploy. General Cole, he continued, turning to another commander, support Leith with the 4th Division. We're going to roll up their entire left wing. What Wellington understood, what Marmont was beginning to realize with growing horror, was that once you disrupted an army's formation, once you broke one part of their line, the entire structure became vulnerable. Like pulling one card from a house of cards, the whole thing could collapse if you pressed the advantage. But just as Wellington's forces were preparing to advance, something unexpected happened. A British artillery battery, firing at long range at the French command group on the Arapil Grande, scored a direct hit. The shell, probably fired more in hope than expectation of hitting anything specific, exploded right in the middle of Marmont's staff. Marmont himself went down hard, his right arm shattered by shrapnel, wounds across his torso and legs. His chief of staff, General Bonnet, was killed instantly. 2 other senior officers were wounded. For a few critical minutes, the French army had no commander. No one knew who was in charge. Officers argued, divisions received contradictory orders, and the carefully planned French counterattack faltered before it even began. Wellington, watching from his ridge, saw the confusion in the French ranks and recognized it for what it was. Press them, he ordered quietly. Press them hard. They're confused and leaderless. If we hit them now, we can break them completely. What followed was what military historians would later call one of the most perfectly executed assaults in the Napoleonic Wars. British and Portuguese divisions advanced in echelon, one after another, each hitting the French line at its weakest point, breaking through, then wheeling to hit the next position from the flank. The French fought desperately. These were veteran soldiers who'd conquered most of Europe. They didn't break easily. Individual units formed squares, held their ground, fired volley after volley into the British advancing lines. Lieutenant Mercier found himself in the middle of this hell. His battalion had been ordered to hold a small ridge against British assault. They'd formed line, 2 ranks deep, and now they were firing as fast as they could load. Load! Make ready! Fire! The commands were shouted again and again, becoming a rhythmic chant that barely registered consciously. Load powder, ram ball, prime pan, present, fire. Then do it again and again and again. Through the smoke, Mercier could see British redcoats advancing. They took casualties, men falling from French fire, but they kept coming, maintained their formation, kept advancing with mechanical precision. They're not human, someone muttered nearby. Nothing stops them. But they were human. Mercier could see their faces now as they got closer. Young faces, terrified faces, determined faces. Men like him, far from home, following orders, trying not to die. The British line fired a volley at close range. The French line staggered, men falling, gaps opening. Before they could recover and return fire, the British charged with bayonets. Mercier had been in bayonet charges before. They were usually brief. One side or the other would break before the lines actually met, because nobody wanted to engage in close combat with sharpened steel. This time, the lines met. It was butchery. Men stabbing with bayonets, clubbing with musket butts, grappling hand to hand. The sounds were worse than the sights, the wet impact of steel into flesh, the screams of wounded and dying men, the grunts and curses of soldiers fighting for their lives. Mercier found himself face to face with a British sergeant, a huge man with a scarred face and eyes that showed nothing but determination. The sergeant lunged with the bayonet. Mercier barely parried. They struggled for a moment, strength against strength. Then someone, Mercier never knew who, shot the sergeant from the side. The big man went down, and Mercier stumbled backwards, gasping for breath, his hands shaking. Around him, the French line was breaking. Too many casualties, too much pressure, too many British soldiers pressing forward. Officers tried to maintain order, but it was useless. "Fall back," someone shouted. "Fall back to the next ridge." The French began to retreat, not running like Thomier's division had done, but withdrawing in something resembling order, stopping to fire volleys, then falling back again, trying to maintain cohesion even as they gave ground. Mercier retreated with them, his mind numb, his body moving on pure instinct. Around him, men he'd known for years were falling, shot, bayoneted, trampled. The battalion that had formed up that morning with 700 men now numbered maybe 400, and the day wasn't over yet. Sergeant Dufour, the veteran who'd counseled patience just that morning, was lying dead somewhere behind them. Mercier had seen him fall, shot through the head by a British sharpshooter. The battle became a running fight across 3 miles of Spanish hillside. Individual units fought with tremendous courage on both sides. French infantry formed squares and held against British cavalry charges. British soldiers advanced under withering fire and took positions that should have been impossible to capture.
But the overall outcome was never really in doubt after that first devastating blow against Thomier. Wellington had seized the initiative, and he never let it go. Every time the French tried to form a new defensive line, British forces hit them before they could properly deploy. Every time they tried to counterattack, they found British units already in position to meet them. By 7 in the evening, as the sun began to set over the Spanish plains, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of red and purple, the French army was in full retreat. Not a rout exactly, they were too professional for that, but a complete tactical withdrawal from the field. They'd lost 7,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured in less than 4 hours of fighting. 2 generals were dead. Another, Marmont himself, wounded so severely he'd be invalided out of Spain. 20 regimental standards had been captured, 11 artillery pieces abandoned on the field. Wellington's casualties were about 5,000, still heavy, still representing thousands of families who would receive the news that their sons, husbands, brothers were dead. But in return, he'd achieved something remarkable. He'd defeated a French army in open battle, something few commanders had managed during Napoleon's reign. As darkness fell completely, bringing blessed coolness after the day's brutal heat, Wellington rode across the battlefield. His horse picked its way carefully through the debris of combat, discarded weapons, abandoned equipment, bodies of men and horses. The smell was already terrible. Gunpowder smoke mixed with blood and death and human waste. Wounded men cried out from the darkness, calling for water, for help, for their mothers. The usual aftermath of violence, the price that was paid for strategic objectives and territorial control. Wellington's face was impassive as always, but his eyes took in every detail. He'd need to write reports, explain his decisions, justify his casualties. That was the burden of command, not just winning battles, but explaining afterward why the cost was necessary. He found Pakenham sitting on a stone wall near what had been the center of the fighting. The young general's uniform was torn and bloodied, some of it his own blood from minor wounds, most of it from the men he'd been leading. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and shock. "Well done, Edward," Wellington said simply, sitting beside him. Pakenham didn't look up. "We lost a lot of good men, sir. Captain Morrison, dead.
Lieutenant Graves, dead. Sergeant Major Collins, dead. I have a list of 43 officers killed or wounded, and God knows how many enlisted men. Yes, Wellington said quietly, but we won, and in this war, that's what matters. Every man who died today died advancing our cause, pushing the French closer to defeat, bringing the end of this war closer. It was cold comfort, and both men knew it. The dead didn't care about strategic objectives or ultimate victory. They were just dead. But Wellington had learned long ago that command meant making peace with that reality. You did your best to preserve your soldiers' lives, but ultimately, soldiers' lives were the currency you spent to purchase victory. The trick was spending them wisely, not wastefully, making sure their deaths accomplished something meaningful rather than just adding to the casualty lists. Marmont will recover from his wounds, Pakenham said quietly. I heard he was evacuated to a field hospital. Wellington nodded. Probably. But he won't hold major command again, not after this. A defeated general is damaged goods in Napoleon's army. This battle ended his career as effectively as if we'd killed him. Pakenham was quiet for a long moment. Then, do you ever think about them? The French, I mean. They're just men like us, following orders, doing their duty, trying not to die. Wellington looked at his brother-in-law with something that might have been sympathy. Every day, but I don't let it stop me from killing them when necessary. That's war, Edward. You recognize the humanity of your enemy while still being willing to destroy them. It's a paradox that every commander has to live with. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the sounds of the battlefield, the cries of the wounded, the calls of medical orderlies searching for survivors, the quiet conversations of soldiers making camp among the dead. Finally, Wellington stood. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll pursue the French, try to maximize our advantage. This battle changed the war, but it didn't end it. There's still work to do. Pakenham watched his commander walk away, moving through the darkness with that peculiar confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, even in circumstances that would terrify most people. In fact, the Battle of Salamanca did change the war dramatically. Within 3 months, Wellington would enter Madrid in triumph, driving King Joseph Bonaparte from his throne. The Spanish people, seeing that French armies could be defeated, rose up with renewed vigor. Other French marshals, learning of Marmont's defeat, became more cautious about engaging Wellington directly. And in distant Russia, Napoleon himself was beginning his disastrous invasion that would ultimately destroy the Grande Armée and mark the beginning of the end of his empire. The victory at Salamanca encouraged Britain to continue its support of the Peninsular War, tying down French resources that Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. 2 years later, Wellington would be fighting on French soil itself, driving toward Paris. 3 years after Salamanca, he would face Napoleon at Waterloo and win again, using many of the same principles: patience, careful positioning, and the ability to exploit enemy mistakes. But all of that started here, on this dusty Spanish hillside, with one commander's patience and another commander's fatal impatience. 3 days after the battle, Private Browning and Private Cooper were sitting around a campfire, sharing what passed for dinner in the British Army: salt beef, hard biscuit, and weak tea. "We won," Browning said, still sounding slightly surprised. Cooper nodded, chewing his tough beef thoughtfully. "That we did. Didn't think the Duke had it in him, all that marching and waiting. But when he finally struck, he struck proper." "Mercier?" Browning asked. They'd heard rumors that their battalion had captured a French officer. "Lieutenant from the 22nd Line, wounded, captured during the retreat. Said his whole battalion got chewed up." Browning was quiet for a moment. "You ever think it could have been us? If Wellington had made different choices? If he'd attacked at the wrong time?" "Could have been," Cooper agreed. "That's why they pay generals the big money, I suppose, making the choices that mean we live and the other poor bastards die." It was a soldier's philosophy, dark, pragmatic, accepting of realities that civilians didn't want to think about. but it was also true. And meanwhile, in a field hospital several miles away, Lieutenant Mercier was having his wounds treated by a British surgeon. His left arm was broken, he had a deep gash across his ribs, and he'd lost enough blood that he was dizzy and weak. But he was alive, which is more than could be said for most of his battalion.
The British surgeon, a harried man named Dr. Thompson who'd been operating non-stop since the battle ended, finished bandaging Mercier's wounds. "You'll live," he said in heavily accented French. "The arm will heal, though you might not have full strength in it again." "Thank you," Mercier managed. Thompson shrugged. "We treat the wounded regardless of which side they were on. That's the rule. Though I'll admit it feels strange patching up men who were trying to kill us just hours ago." "War is strange," Mercier agreed quietly. "That it is, that it is." After the surgeon left, Mercier lay on his cot, staring at the canvas roof of the hospital tent, thinking about the battle, about his dead comrades, about the future. He joined Napoleon's army believing in the revolution, in the ideals of liberty and equality and fraternity. 7 years of warfare had worn away most of that idealism, replacing it with cynicism and exhaustion. But he'd stayed because his friends were in the army, because he had no other skills, because leaving would have meant being branded a deserter. Now his friends were dead. Sergeant Dufour, who'd taught him how to survive in combat. Captain Laurent, who'd recommended him for promotion. Lieutenant Blanc, who'd saved his life at Jena. All gone. And for what? So Napoleon could rule Spain? So some king nobody wanted could sit on a throne? Mercier closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the sounds of the wounded, French and British alike, made rest impossible. So he just lay there, thinking about choices and consequences, about commanders who made decisions that sent thousands of men to their deaths. He wondered if Marshal Marmont, lying in his own hospital bed somewhere, was having similar thoughts. Probably not. Generals rarely question their own decisions, even when those decisions led to disaster. But Mercier, who'd been a soldier for 7 years and seen enough death for several lifetimes, was beginning to understand something important. The difference between a good commander and a bad one wasn't courage or brilliance or even luck. It was judgment. The ability to know when to act and when to wait, when to risk everything and when to preserve your forces, when to seize an opportunity and when to let it pass. Wellington had that judgment. Marmont, for all his energy and confidence, did not. And 7,000 French soldiers had paid the price for that difference. Years later, after the war was over and Napoleon was safely imprisoned on St. Helena, Wellington would be asked about Salamanca. What was the key to his victory that day? Wellington thought for a moment, then gave an answer that was pure Wellington, precise, practical, without a hint of false modesty or self-aggrandizement. "Marmont made a mistake. I saw it. I acted on it immediately. That's all." But of course it wasn't all. It was years of training and experience, thousands of hours studying maps and terrain. It was the ability to read enemy movements and predict their intentions. It was the trust he'd built with his officers and men that let him give orders and know they'd be followed instantly, without question. Most of all, it was the understanding that in war, patience was often more valuable than aggression, and the ability to wait for the right moment was often more important than the courage to attack. Wellington spent 3 weeks marching and countermarching, frustrating his own men with his apparent caution. But that caution wasn't weakness, it was discipline. He was waiting for Marmont to give him something he could exploit, some mistake he could capitalize on. And when that moment came, when Thomier's division pushed too far forward and separated from the main French army, Wellington didn't hesitate for even a second. He didn't call a conference with his generals to debate the merits of different approaches. He didn't write careful orders or wait for better conditions. He just attacked, immediately, overwhelmingly, decisively. 45 minutes from recognition to action to victory.
That's how fast history can change when a commander recognizes his moment and seizes it without hesitation. The battlefield of Salamanca is still there today if you want to visit. It looks peaceful now, just hills and fields, crops growing where men once fought and died, quiet and ordinary, with nothing to suggest that tens of thousands of soldiers clashed there over 200 years ago. There's a small monument marking where Thomier fell, another where Marmont was wounded. If you look carefully, you can still trace the movements of the armies, see the ridges where Wellington watched and waited, identify the ground where Pakenham's division shattered the French left wing. But mostly, it's just empty countryside. The dead are long buried, the wounded long healed or dead themselves, the armies long disbanded, the empires that sent them long fallen. All that remains is the lesson. And the lesson is this: wars aren't won by the commanders who attack first or the most often. They're won by commanders who know when to attack, who can recognize the precise moment their enemy is vulnerable, and who have the discipline to wait for that moment even when waiting is hard. Wellington understood this in a way that Marmont never did. And on July 22, 1812, on a hot Spanish afternoon, that understanding made all the difference. 7,000 French soldiers learned that lesson the hard way. So did Marmont, his career effectively ended by one impatient decision. But Wellington went on to greater victories, building on the reputation he'd earned at Salamanca, eventually becoming one of the most celebrated military commanders in history. All because he knew how to watch, how to wait, and how to strike without hesitation when his enemy finally made the mistake he'd been waiting for. That's the real story of Salamanca. Not just tactics and casualty figures, not just the strategic implications for the Peninsular War, but the timeless lesson about patience, observation, and decisive action. A lesson written in blood on Spanish soil, but one that echoes through history, relevant to anyone who needs to know when to wait and when to strike. Wellington mastered that balance, and that's why, more than 2 centuries later, we're still talking about what he accomplished on that long, hot July day when patience finally transformed into perfect violence and changed the course of a war. In the days following the battle, the true scale of what had happened at Salamanca began to reveal itself, not just in casualty numbers or territorial gains, but in the subtle shifts of power and perception that would ripple across Europe for years to come. Wellington established his headquarters in Salamanca itself, the ancient university city that had given its name to the battle. The locals greeted him as a liberator, throwing flowers in the streets, offering wine and food, celebrating their freedom from French occupation. But Wellington, ever practical, knew that celebrations were premature. The French still controlled most of Spain. King Joseph still sat on his throne in Madrid. And while Marmont's army had been defeated, it hadn't been destroyed. The survivors were retreating northward, and other French armies were maneuvering to block Wellington's advance. Still, something fundamental had changed. On July 25th, 3 days after the battle, Wellington sat in the commandeered office of Salamanca's university rector, writing dispatches to London. His hand moved steadily across the paper, the scratching of his quill the only sound in the quiet room.
To Earl Bathurst, Secretary of State for War, he wrote, "I have the honor to report a complete victory over Marshal Marmont's army of Portugal. The enemy has been driven from the field with severe losses and is in full retreat northward. Our own casualties, while significant, are considerably less than those inflicted upon the French." He paused, considering his next words carefully. Wellington understood that battles were fought twice, once on the field and once in the reports and dispatches that shaped how those battles were perceived by politicians and the public. The action at Salamanca demonstrates conclusively that French armies, when properly engaged under favorable circumstances, can be defeated decisively by British forces. This should provide encouragement to our Spanish allies and proof that continued prosecution of the Peninsular Campaign will ultimately succeed. Gordon entered quietly, carrying more papers. Casualty reports from all divisions, sir. Final tallies. Wellington set down his quill and took the papers, reading through them with the same careful attention he gave to everything. 5,214 British and Portuguese casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Each number representing a man who'd woken up that morning expecting to see another day, and didn't. Heavy, Wellington said quietly. But the French lost more, Gordon offered, nearly 8,000 by our count, plus the prisoners. Yes, Wellington set the papers aside. But I don't measure success by comparing our dead to theirs. I measure it by whether the objective was achieved at an acceptable cost. In this case, it was, but that doesn't make the cost any less real. Gordon was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sir, if I may ask, when you gave the order to attack, when you saw Thomier's division exposed, were you certain it would work?" Wellington looked at his aide-de-camp thoughtfully. "Certain? No. In war, certainty is a luxury we rarely have, but I was confident. I'd been watching Marmont for weeks, studying his patterns, his tendencies. He was aggressive, impatient, the kind of commander who valued action over caution. I knew that eventually that impatience would create an opportunity. I just had to be ready to recognize it when it appeared. And if you'd been wrong, if it had been a trap, then we'd have paid a heavy price for my mistake. That's the burden of command, Gordon. Every decision you make could result in men dying. You can't let that paralyze you, but you also can't forget it. The moment you start making decisions without considering the human cost is the moment you become unfit for command." It was one of the longest philosophical statements Wellington had ever heard, who usually kept his thoughts tightly controlled. But perhaps the aftermath of battle, surrounded by the evidence of what his decisions had wrought, made even Wellington more reflective than usual. Across the city, in the hospitals where the wounded were being treated, the reality of that human cost was impossible to ignore. Private Browning lay on a cot in what had once been a church, now converted to a hospital out of necessity. He'd been shot in the leg during the final stages of the battle, a musket ball that had shattered his shin bone and left him unable to walk. Dr. Thompson had examined him that morning and delivered the verdict Browning had been dreading. The leg would have to come off. The bone was too badly damaged to heal properly, and infection was already setting in. Amputation was the only option. "When?" Browning asked, his voice barely steady. "This afternoon. The sooner the better before the infection spreads." Now Browning lay waiting, trying not to think about what was coming. Around him, other wounded men were in similar situations, waiting for surgery, recovering from surgery, or dying despite surgery. The smell of blood and infection and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. Cooper sat beside his friend's cot, having talked his way past the orderlies by claiming to be Browning's brother. "You'll be all right," he said, trying to sound confident. "I've seen men lose legs and live to tell about it. Hell, Sergeant Morrison fought at Talavera with a wooden leg." "Morrison died at Salamanca," Browning said quietly. Cooper winced. "Bad example, but the point stands. You'll survive this." "And then what? I can't be a soldier with one leg. They'll invalid me out, send me back to England with a small pension that won't be enough to live on. I'll end up begging on street corners like all the other crippled veterans." It was a legitimate fear. The British government's care for wounded veterans was minimal at best. A small pension, maybe, if you were lucky, but nothing that could actually support a man who could no longer work. "We'll figure something out," Cooper said, though he had no idea what. "You saved my life at Ciudad Rodrigo, remember? When that French cavalry came at us and you pulled me down behind the wall? I owe you. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Browning managed a weak smile. "You're a good friend, William. Better than I deserve." Before Cooper could respond, Dr. Thompson appeared with two orderlies. "Time," he said simply. Browning closed his eyes and nodded. The orderlies lifted him carefully, carrying him to the operating room, actually the church's vestry, where a table had been set up and instruments laid out. Cooper watched them go, feeling helpless and angry. Angry at the French for shooting his friend, angry at the war that had brought them all here, angry at himself for not being able to do anything to help.
but mostly he felt a deep, weary sadness. This was what victory looked like close up, not the grand strategic achievements that generals wrote about in their dispatches, but men like Browning losing their legs, losing their futures, paying a price that would follow them for the rest of their lives. And for what? So Wellington could report to London that he'd defeated Marmont? So politicians could feel good about the progress of the war? Cooper knew these were dangerous thoughts, seditious even. A soldier wasn't supposed to question the purpose of the war or the decisions of his commanders. But sitting in that converted church, surrounded by the wounded and dying, it was hard to question everything. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Lieutenant Mercier was having similar thoughts. He'd been moved from the field hospital to a more permanent facility in Salamanca, a former monastery now serving as a prisoner of war hospital. His wounds were healing slowly but steadily. The British doctors had done good work, treating him with the same care they gave their own wounded. That surprised him. He'd expected at best indifference, at worst active cruelty. Instead, the British treated their prisoners with something approaching respect. They were fed the same rations as British soldiers, given medical care, even allowed to keep their personal possessions. "Strange, isn't it?" said the man in the next cot, a French captain named Rousseau, who'd been captured during the retreat. "We spend all day trying to kill them, and then they patch us up and feed us." "It's the British way," Mercier said. "They have rules about these things, codes of conduct. It's very civilized." "Civilized," Rousseau repeated, tasting the word. "Is there anything civilized about war?"
It was a good question. Mercier had been thinking about it for days now, ever since the battle. Was there any way to make war civilized? To put rules and codes around organized violence? Or was the whole concept absurd, like trying to have polite murder? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think trying to maintain some humanity, even in war, is important. Otherwise, we're just animals killing each other." Rousseau grunted. Animals might be more honest about it. At least they don't pretend they're fighting for noble causes while they rip each other apart. A British officer entered the ward, making his rounds. He was young, maybe 25, with the insignia of a lieutenant colonel. He stopped at each bed, asking the wounded prisoners if they needed anything, checking on their conditions. When he reached Mercier's cot, he paused. "You're the one from the 22nd line, yes? The one who was captured near the end?" "Oui," Mercier replied carefully. "Lieutenant Jean-Baptiste Mercier." The British officer nodded. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Fitzroy Somerset, aide-de-camp to the Duke of Wellington. The Duke wanted me to check on the prisoners, make sure they're being treated properly." Mercier was surprised. "The Duke concerns himself with prisoners?" Somerset smiled slightly. "The Duke concerns himself with everything. It's both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. But yes, he believes in treating prisoners according to the conventions of war. It's a matter of honor and also practical. If French soldiers know they'll be treated well if captured, they're more likely to surrender rather than fight to the death." It was a cynical calculation wrapped in civilized language, but Mercier couldn't argue with the logic, and honestly, he was grateful for it. Without proper medical care, his wounds likely would have killed him. "Thank you," Mercier said, "for the treatment, for the care. I did not expect this." Somerset nodded. "War is complicated enough without adding unnecessary cruelty. Now, is there anything you need? Anything we can provide?" Mercier thought for a moment. "Paper and pen if possible. I would like to write to my family, let them know I'm alive." "I'll arrange it. The letters will be censored, of course, but they'll be sent through the usual channels for prisoner correspondence." After Somerset left, Rousseau looked at Mercier with something like amusement. "You're going to write home? Tell them you're a prisoner?" "Better they know I'm a prisoner than think I'm dead. My mother, she worries. At least this way she'll know I'm alive and being treated well." What he didn't say was that he was thinking of asking to remain in British custody even after the war ended. The thought of returning to Napoleon's army, of fighting more battles like Salamanca, filled him with a bone-deep weariness. He'd had enough of war. enough of watching friends die for causes he no longer believed in. But that was a decision for later. For now, he would heal and think and try to make sense of what had happened on that terrible afternoon when his entire world had been shattered in 45 minutes of violence. Back at Wellington's headquarters, the planning for the next phase of the campaign was already underway. Wellington stood over a large map of Spain spread across a table with his senior commanders gathered around. Pakenham, still showing signs of exhaustion from the battle, General Hill, who'd commanded the right wing, General Cotton, the cavalry commander, and several others. "Gentlemen," Wellington began, "we've won a significant victory, but we cannot afford to rest on our success. The French have other armies in Spain, and they will be regrouping to counter our advance. We need to press our advantage while they're still reeling from this defeat." "Madrid?" Pakenham suggested, pointing at the Spanish capital on the map. Wellington nodded. "Madrid. If we can take the capital, drive Joseph Bonaparte from his throne, it will be a tremendous blow to French morale and a huge boost to Spanish resistance. But it's not without risks." "The Army of the Center," General Hill indicated, French positions around Madrid. "They're still intact, maybe 30,000 strong." "Yes, but they're demoralized and uncertain. With Marmont defeated, they won't know whether to stand and fight or retreat. If we move quickly, we can get between them and the capital before they decide." It was classic Wellington, not just winning battles, but understanding the psychological impact of those victories and how to exploit them. Marmont's defeat at Salamanca had done more than inflict casualties. It had shaken French confidence throughout Spain. "What about supplies?" Cotton asked. "We're already at the end of a long supply line, and Madrid is another 100 miles south." "We'll have to live on the land to some extent. Not ideal, but necessary. The Spanish will support us where they can, and once we take Madrid, we can establish new supply depots using the city's resources." The discussion continued for another hour, working through logistics, timelines, and potential complications. Wellington listened to all input, asked probing questions, but ultimately made the decisions himself. He'd learned long ago that command by committee rarely worked. You could seek advice, but ultimately one person had to take responsibility for the final call. "We move in 2 days," Wellington finally decided. "That gives the wounded time to be stabilized and evacuated, gives the men some rest, and gives us time to consolidate our forces. But no longer. Speed is essential now." As the meeting broke up and officers dispersed to their units, Pakenham lingered. "Sir, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "That moment during the battle, when you saw Thomier's division exposed and gave the order to attack, was that instinct or calculation?" Wellington considered the question carefully. "Both, I suppose. The calculation was recognizing the tactical opportunity, understanding that we could overwhelm that division before support arrived. But the instinct was knowing that this was the moment, that if we waited even 10 more minutes, the opportunity would disappear. You can't always explain instinct in logical terms, but that doesn't make it less real." "How do you develop that kind of instinct?" questioned Pakenham. "Experience, mostly. Years of studying battles, both victories and defeats, learning to understand not just what happened, but why, learning to recognize patterns. And also," Wellington paused, choosing his words carefully, "also accepting that you won't always get it right, that sometimes your instinct will be wrong and men will die because of it. You can't let the fear of being wrong paralyze you." Pakenham nodded slowly. "I'm not sure I have that kind of certainty or willingness to accept the consequences of being wrong." "Then you're more thoughtful than most commanders," Wellington said, almost gently. "The dangerous ones are those who never question themselves, who believe they're always right. A bit of doubt, a bit of humility about your own infallibility, that's healthy. It keeps you sharp, makes you think carefully before committing. Just don't let it stop you from acting when action is necessary." It was advice born from years of command, from victories and defeats,
from the accumulated weight of thousands of decisions that had sent men to their deaths or brought them home alive. Pakenham thanked him and left, his mind full of thoughts about leadership, responsibility, and the terrible burden of command. 2 days later, Wellington's army marched south toward Madrid. The soldiers were tired, some still recovering from the battle, but their spirits were high. They'd won. They'd beaten the French in open battle, and now they were advancing, taking the fight to the enemy rather than just reacting to French moves. Private Cooper marched with his battalion, Browning's empty place beside him a constant reminder of the cost of victory. Browning had survived the amputation but was being evacuated back to Portugal, beginning the long journey that would eventually take him back to England and an uncertain future. Cooper had promised to visit if he survived the war, had promised to help however he could. Whether he'd be able to keep those promises remained to be seen, but making them had felt important. As they marched, Cooper found himself thinking about what it all meant. They'd fought at Salamanca and won, would fight at Madrid and maybe win there too. But then what? Another battle, another victory, another list of casualties. When did it end? He didn't have answers, but he kept marching, because that's what soldiers did. You marched where you were told, fought when ordered, and tried to survive until someone finally decided the war was over. In the prisoner hospital in Salamanca, Mercier had received paper and pen and was carefully composing a letter to his mother. "Dear Maman," he wrote in French, knowing it would be translated and censored, but hoping the essential message would get through. "I write to inform you that I am alive and well, though I have been wounded and captured by the British forces. Do not worry. I am being treated well, my wounds are healing, and I am in no danger." He paused, considering what else to say. How do you explain to your mother that you'd been in a battle where thousands died, that you'd watched friends killed, had nearly died yourself, and were now a prisoner in a foreign country with no idea when or if you'd return home? "The war here is difficult," he finally wrote. "I am tired, Maman. Tired of fighting, tired of marching, tired of seeing good men die for causes that seem increasingly unclear. I do not know when I will see you again, but know that I think of you often and hope this letter finds you in good health." He signed it, folded it carefully, and gave it to the British orderly who'd provided the writing materials. Whether it would ever reach his mother in France was uncertain, but he'd done what he could. And then he lay back on his cot and thought about the future, about what came after the war, whenever that might be, about whether he'd ever be able to return to the man he'd been before he'd seen so much death and destruction. He didn't have answers to those questions either, but at least he was alive to ask them, which was more than could be said for Sergeant Dufour, or Captain Laurent, or Lieutenant Blanc, or the thousands of other men who'd fallen at Salamanca. 3 weeks after the battle, Wellington entered Madrid in triumph. King Joseph Bonaparte had fled, French forces had withdrawn, and the Spanish capital erupted in celebration. Wellington was hailed as a liberator, given honors and titles, treated like a conquering hero. But that night, in his quarters in the royal palace, Wellington sat alone and thought about Salamanca, about the 45 minutes that had decided the battle, about the decisions he'd made and their consequences. He'd won, that was what mattered strategically, but he couldn't forget the cost, the 5,000 casualties, the wounded like Browning who'd carry the scars for life, the dead who'd never see another sunrise. Was it worth it? He asked himself quietly, staring out the window at the celebrating city below. And the answer, as it always was complicated. Strategically, yes, the victory at Salamanca had changed the entire dynamic of the Peninsular War, had proven that French armies could be beaten, had opened the path to Madrid and ultimately to victory. But for the individual soldiers who died or been maimed, for Browning losing his leg, for Mercier captured and imprisoned far from home, for the thousands of families who'd received news that their sons and husbands and brothers wouldn't be coming home, for them, the calculus was different. The strategic victory didn't ease their personal loss.
And that was the burden of command that Wellington carried, the knowledge that every victory came with a price paid in human suffering, and that he was the one who decided that price was worth paying. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the celebrating city, thinking about the battle, about the choices he'd made, about the men who died so he could claim this victory. And then, because he was Wellington, and he'd learned long ago that dwelling on things you couldn't change was useless, he turned away from the window and began planning the next campaign. Because the war wasn't over. There were still French armies in Spain, still battles to be fought, still victories to be won, and prices to be paid. And Wellington, for better or worse, was the man who would make those decisions, calculate those costs, and bear the burden of command until the war finally ended. That's the real story of Salamanca, not just what happened, but what it meant to those who lived through it and those who carry its lessons forward. A story of military genius and human cost, of patience rewarded and impatience punished, of decisions made in moments that echo through lifetimes. Wellington's finest hour and his heaviest burden, forever intertwined like the victory and the casualties, the triumph and the grief, the strategic necessity and the human tragedy. That's what great commanders understand. That's what separates legend from mere competence, not just winning, but understanding the full weight of what winning costs, and being willing to pay that price when necessary, while never forgetting that the price was paid in human lives and human futures. 45 minutes. That's all it took to win the Battle of Salamanca, but a lifetime to understand what that victory truly meant.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.